You just heard the voice of a killer. That audio clip, 3 words, spoken by an unidentified man on a hiking trail in Delphi, Indiana, became one of the most listened-to pieces of evidence in American true crime history. For 5 years, millions of people heard it. They analyzed it. They argued about it. They posted it on forums and ran it through audio software and matched it against voice samples of men they suspected. For 5 years, no arrest. The 2 girls who recorded that voice were already dead by the time anyone heard it. Abby Williams was 13 years old. Libby German was 14. It was February. It was cold. They went for a hike. The kind of afternoon hike that teenagers take in small towns because there is not much else to do, and the trail is beautiful, and they are 13 and 14 years old, and they feel completely safe. They were not safe. On February 13th, 2017, Abby and Libby walked onto the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana. They never walked off it. Their bodies were found the next morning, half a mile from the bridge, in the woods near a creek, their throats cut, partially covered with sticks. And on Libby's phone, the phone still in her pocket when she was found, investigators discovered something that would haunt this case for nearly a decade. A video, a recording, a man walking toward them on the bridge, his face partially visible, his voice captured as he gave them an order. Guys, down the hill. Libby German had turned on her camera, on a bridge, in the cold, with a stranger walking toward them. She was 14 years old, and somehow, in that moment, she understood that something was wrong. And she did the one thing she could think to do. She hit record. The man in that video, police called him Bridge Guy. For 5 years he had a nickname, but no name. A face, but no identity. A voice that millions of people had heard, but no one could place. He was hiding in plain sight. In the same small town, going to the same grocery stores, living the same quiet, unremarkable life, while Abby and Libby's families buried their daughters and waited for justice that never came. His name was Richard Allen. He worked at the CVS pharmacy in Delphi. He was 50 years old when he was arrested in October 2022, 5 years, 8 months, and 16 days after he killed those girls. This is their story, and it is one of the most haunting cases in American criminal history. To understand this story, you have to understand Delphi. Delphi, Indiana. Population, approximately 3,000 people. It sits in Carroll County, in the northwestern part of the state, a flat, agricultural landscape where the winters are grey and bone cold, and the summers are green and brief. The kind of town where a meat-packing plant is the largest employer, where everyone knows what car their neighbor drives, where people say hello to strangers with smiles, genuinely. Our community is very friendly, one Delphi resident described it. People say hello with smiles. The Monon High Bridge is one of Delphi's landmarks, an old weathered railroad trestle stretching over a creek, long out of service, converted into a trail destination. The kind of place locals know intimately. Kids grow up walking it. Families hike it on weekends. It is beautiful in the way that forgotten industrial things sometimes are. Rusted iron against Indiana sky. In February, the trees along the trail are bare. The creek below is low and grey. The ground is hard. It is quiet out there. Peaceful even, until it wasn't. In a town of 3,000 people, everyone knew the families of Abby Williams and Libby German. Libby lived with her grandparents, Becky and Mike Patty, a family rooted in Delphi for generations. Becky Patty would become one of the most vocal advocates for justice in the years that followed, speaking publicly and consistently, refusing to let the community forget what had happened on that trail. Abby Williams was a quiet 13-year-old, a girl described by those who knew her as gentle and warm. Libby was 14, outgoing, funny, the kind of kid who lit up a room. Her older sister Kelsey adored her. They were not statistics, They were not case numbers. They were two girls from a small Indiana town who went for a walk on a Monday afternoon in February because it was a school holiday and the trail was close and life in Delphi was safe. It had always been safe. February 13th, 2017. A Monday. No school. It was the day before Valentine's Day, and Carroll Consolidated School District had the day off. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Kelsey German, Libby's older sister, dropped the two girls off on County Road 300 North, east of the Hoosier Heartland Highway. The plan was simple. The girls would hike the trail, cross the Monon High Bridge, and Libby's father would pick them up at the other end a few hours later. It was broad daylight. It was a trail they had walked before. Libby had her phone. Kelsey drove away. The girls walked the trail. They crossed onto the Monon High Bridge. At some point on that bridge, a man appeared. He was walking toward them. His hands were in his pockets. His posture was deliberate. Libby raised her phone and began recording. The video shows a figure moving toward the camera, heavy-set, wearing jeans, a blue jacket, a cap pulled low, his face partially visible, his pace unhurried. As he reached them, his voice low and flat. "Guys, down the hill." That was the last known recording of what happened to Abby Williams and Libby German. At the appointed pickup time, Libby's father arrived at the trail's end. The girls were not there. He waited. He tried calling. No answer. At 5:30 that evening, Abby and Libby were reported missing. Search parties went out immediately. Friends, family, neighbors, law enforcement. Everyone who could walk a trail in the cold February dark was out looking. Through the night, into the next morning. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, searchers found them. Their bodies lay in the woods near Deer Creek, approximately a quarter-mile from the bridge where they had last been seen alive. Both girls had their throats cut. They were partially covered with sticks, arranged deliberately. Between their bodies, an unspent .40 caliber bullet. The small town of Delphi, the friendly town, the safe town, the town where people said hello with smiles, would never be the same. When investigators recovered Libby German's phone, what they found changed everything about this case. The video was brief, fragmented, shot by a 14-year-old girl who was frightened and thinking fast. But it existed. In the history of violent crime, a victim who manages to capture their attacker on video, on their own phone, while the crime is happening, is extraordinarily rare. Libby German did that. In the final minutes of her life, she had the presence of mind to raise her phone and hit record. Investigators understood immediately what they had. Within days, on February 17th, 2017, just 4 days after the murders, Indiana State Police released a still image from the video, a blurry but recognizable figure on the bridge, hands in pockets, cap pulled down. They called him Bridge Guy. They asked the public, "Do you know this man?" The tips began flooding in, thousands of them, from Delphi, from Indiana, from across the country. True crime communities online became obsessed with the case, analyzing every pixel of the video, every frame, every shadow. Amateur sleuths ran the audio through filters, trying to isolate the voice, match the cadence, identify the accent. In April 2019, police released an updated suspect sketch, a different composite from the earlier image, suggesting investigators had new information about what Bridge Guy might look like. They said something that would later feel like a direct clue. They believed the suspect was, quote, hiding in plain sight, almost certainly someone from Delphi, or someone who knew Delphi well. The phrase hiding in plain sight took on a specific, crushing irony when the truth finally emerged. Because Richard Allen was not hiding at all. He was working at the CVS pharmacy on Washington Street in Delphi, filling prescriptions, making small talk, being a familiar, unremarkable face in a town of 3,000 people. Some Delphi residents who knew him described him as quiet, not particularly warm, not someone who made a strong impression. He was a familiar face if you went into CVS, one resident said. And here is the detail that makes this case uniquely maddening. Richard Allen had reported himself. 3 days after the murders, 3 days, Allen approached a Department of Natural Resources conservation officer who was assisting with the investigation in a grocery store parking lot. He told the officer that he had been on the trail on February 13th, that he had passed 3 girls along the way. The officer wrote it up, filed the paperwork, and that paperwork, with Allen's name on it, was filed incorrectly, misfiled, buried in a box of thousands of tips that poured into the investigation. His last name had been recorded wrong. The file was marked cleared. For 5 years, Richard Allen's name sat in a box, waiting, misfiled, one wrong letter in a last name standing between justice and oblivion. 2017 became 2018. 2018 became 2019. The case attracted enormous attention. A true crime podcast, Down the Hill, from the Wall Street Journal covered it in exhaustive detail. Online communities dedicated themselves to solving it. Every new detail, every new press conference from Indiana State Police became a national event. Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter made periodic appearances, each one charged with emotion, each one a plea directed almost personally at the killer. In one press conference, Carter spoke directly to him. He said, "We want to talk to you. You have never been, and are not, and never will be, smarter than us." It was the kind of statement that sounds performative until you consider the context. A man who had been watching every one of these press conferences, from his house, in Delphi, going to work the next morning. Richard Allen watched those press conferences too. He knew what Bridge Guy's blurry image looked like. He had seen it plastered on billboards, shared across social media, printed on flyers posted in the very CVS where he worked. He had watched the case unfold in real time, as a suspect, watching the investigation publicly, for 5 years. What that must have felt like, we cannot fully know. But we know something about what it does to a person. Because when Richard Allen was finally arrested and placed in prison, he began to fall apart. He was placed in solitary confinement, conditions that his defense attorneys later described as genuinely inhumane. Isolated, confined, no longer able to walk out of the CVS and drive home to his family. And in that isolation, he began to confess, not once, not twice, over 60 times. He confessed to his wife over the prison phone. He confessed to his mother. He confessed to the prison psychologist who treated him. He confessed to the warden. He confessed to prison staff. To other inmates. He told the psychologist directly, "I killed Abby and Libby." But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before all of that, before the arrest, the confessions, the trial, there was a volunteer file clerk, a woman who was helping investigators sort through years of accumulated tips in 2022. A woman who came across a file in a box, a report with a wrong last name marked as cleared, and thought, this doesn't seem right. Her name was Kathy Shank. She was a volunteer. And she is, in some ways, the reason Richard Allen is in prison today. Shank testified at trial that she noticed the report, that the name seemed off, that she dug into it and made the connection between the man who had reported himself to the DNR officer in that parking lot in February 2017 and the description of Bridge Guy. She brought it to investigators. They looked at the name, Richard Allen. He lived in Delphi. He worked in Delphi. He had been on the trail that day. He had told them so himself. And then his name had sat in a box for 5 years. Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett, who later testified at trial, put it plainly. Allen was hiding in plain sight. And the investigation fell in the cracks. Who was Richard Allen? He was, by all external appearances, the most ordinary man in the world. He was born in 1971, making him 45 years old on the day Abby and Libby died on that trail. He had lived in Delphi for years. He was married. He worked as a pharmacy technician at the local CVS, a job that put him in daily contact with the people of Delphi, their prescriptions, their health, their faces. He was quiet, not particularly memorable, not someone people described with strong adjectives in either direction, not kind, not cruel, not funny, not cold, just present, just there. After the murders, after the press conferences, the billboards, the audio released to the public, he kept going to work. He kept living in Delphi. And in a detail that is difficult to process, Becky Patty, Libby's grandmother, testified that after the murders, Alan had printed photos of the two girls from the CVS photo kiosk, at no charge, that were later displayed at their funerals. He printed the funeral photos of the girls he had killed, in his own store, with his own hands. When investigators finally focused on Alan in 2022, after Kathy Shank surfaced that misfiled tip, they moved deliberately. In September 2022, they reviewed his original report to the DNR officer. They matched his description of that day to the timeline. They examined surveillance footage from a business near the trail that showed Alan's car at the location. They gathered what they had. On October 26, 2022, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter stood at a podium and announced the arrest of Richard M. Allen for the murders of Abigail Williams and Libby German. Allen was 50 years old, 5 years, 8 months, and 13 days after the girls were killed. The reaction in Delphi was complicated because Richard Allen was not a stranger. He was not someone from outside the community who had passed through and left. He was the man at the CVS, the familiar face behind the pharmacy counter. He wasn't that way, one resident said, meaning he was not outgoing, not warm, but he was known. He was part of the fabric of the place, and he had been living inside that fabric, inside the grief of the community he had devastated, for 5 years. After his arrest, Richard Allen was taken into custody and held at the Carroll County Jail and later transferred to Westville Correctional Facility. His defense attorneys would later argue, forcefully and with genuine conviction, that what happened to Allen in pre-trial detention was a civil rights catastrophe. He was placed in solitary confinement for months, in conditions that one of his attorneys described as a cage. "I wish everyone could take a tour and see the conditions where he was confined," attorney Jennifer Auger said after the trial. Whether the conditions were inhumane, and the defense argued strenuously that they were, what happened inside that isolation was undeniable. Richard Allen began to confess. In April 2023, about 6 months after his arrest, Allen began confessing to the crimes. Initially, he had told the prison psychologist he was innocent. Then, on a phone call, he told his wife, then his mother, then the warden, then other staff, then other inmates. By the time of the trial, prosecutors had catalogued more than 60 separate confessions. 61, by some counts. A state police master trooper who had listened to over 700 of Allen's prison phone calls testified at trial that he had identified Allen's voice as the same voice on Libby's recording. The voice that said, "down the hill," was Richard Allen's voice. The physical evidence was also compelling, if contested. That unspent .40 caliber bullet found between the girls' bodies, investigators matched it, through ballistic analysis, to Allen's own Sig Sauer handgun. The quality and quantity of marks on the bullet, a prosecution expert testified, were consistent with Allen's specific firearm. The defense challenged this strenuously, calling it a magic bullet, arguing the comparison was apples to oranges, and pointing out that no fingerprints, no DNA from Allen, was found at the crime scene or his home. The prosecution also described the sequence of events on that trail. Allen, they said, had forced the girls at gunpoint off the bridge and down the hill toward the creek. He had originally, Alan later confessed, planned to assault them. But when he saw a van nearby, a witness in the area, he changed course. He cut their throats instead. And then he arranged their bodies, covered them with sticks, and walked back out of the woods, back to his car, back to Delphi, back to his ordinary life. There is a particular cruelty in the neatness of it. He walked back. He drove home. He went to work the next day. While searchers were in the woods looking for 2 missing girls, Richard Allen knew exactly where they were. The trial of Richard Allen did not begin on schedule. Before the first juror was seated, the case had already been through a series of extraordinary disruptions. In October 2023, Judge Francis Gull removed Allen's original public defenders from the case, citing gross negligence after crime scene photographs were leaked from their office. The decision was appealed directly to the Indiana Supreme Court, which reinstated the attorneys. It was the kind of pre-trial chaos that defense attorneys later argued had compromised the entire proceeding. The trial finally began on October 18, 2024. It was held in Delphi, in Allen's own town in Carroll County, where the families of the victims lived and where the community had grieved for 7 years. The defense had sought a change of venue, arguing that a fair jury was impossible in a county where the case had defined the community for nearly a decade. The motion was denied. A special judge, Superior Court Judge Francis Gull from Allen County, was brought in to oversee the trial. Jurors were imported from Allen County as well and sequestered throughout. The defense strategy was built on 3 pillars. First, the confessions were not reliable. Allen had been in prolonged solitary confinement, under extraordinary psychological stress. A clinical psychologist from the Indiana Department of Corrections testified that Allen had been diagnosed with serious mental illness and had a grave disability. A defense neuropsychologist testified to severe depression, anxiety, and work-related stress. The implication: a man under those conditions will say almost anything. The confessions, the defense argued, were the product of a broken mind, not a guilty conscience. Second, the physical evidence was insufficient and potentially tainted. No DNA linking Allen to the crime scene, no fingerprints. The bullet evidence was challenged. A defense digital forensics expert raised a startling detail. Headphone or auxiliary cable data from Libby's phone suggested the device may have been connected to something for nearly 5 hours after the girls disappeared. This challenged the prosecution's timeline of when they were killed. The defense raised a provocative alternative theory that someone else had abducted the girls, held them elsewhere, and returned them to the trail the next morning. It was a long-shot argument, but in the absence of DNA and with a contested timeline, it was designed to plant reasonable doubt. Third, and most fundamentally, no witness had explicitly placed Richard Allen as the man on the bridge. The descriptions given by various witnesses of Bridge Guy, the defense argued, did not consistently match Allen's appearance. Attorney Bradley Rossi, closing for the defense, was direct. No witness explicitly identified Allen as the man seen on the hiking trail or the bridge that afternoon. No fingerprint, DNA, or forensic evidence links Allen to the murder scene. It was a real argument, legally sound, and in a system that demands proof beyond reasonable doubt, it deserved to be heard. The trial lasted approximately 3 weeks. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, heard from dozens of witnesses. They saw crime scene photographs that, by all accounts, were deeply disturbing. They heard the audio of Libby's recording played in court. They heard Allen's prison confessions replayed from recordings. Carroll County Prosecutor Nicholas McClelland presented the state's case with clarity and force. He walked the jury through the 60-plus confessions. He argued that a man who confesses to the same crime, to that many different people, over that many months, is not confused or delusional. He is guilty and unable to contain it. He presented the ballistics evidence, the unspent bullet matched to Allen's gun, and argued that the chance of a different weapon producing identical marks was vanishingly small. He called the trooper who had listened to 700 phone calls and identified the voice. He described Allen's behavior on the day of the murders, the drive to the trail, the time at the location, the approach on the bridge, as consistent and coherent. The jury began deliberations on November 7, 2024. They deliberated for approximately 19 hours over 4 days. Special Judge Gull, who had spent years managing one of the most complicated cases in Indiana's recent history, told reporters ahead of the verdict, "Regardless of what the verdict is, people aren't going to be happy." It was an honest acknowledgement of how fractured public opinion had become around this case. The online true crime community, which had spent 7 years building theories, posting analyses, sometimes pointing fingers at people who turned out to be innocent, was deeply divided on Allen's guilt. On November 11, 2024, shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon, the jury returned guilty on all 4 counts, 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felony murder while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. Richard Allen sat emotionless as the verdict was read. At one point, he looked back at his family. Then he was handcuffed and led from the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, people on the sidewalk began to cheer. Kelsey German, Libby's older sister, the one who had dropped the girls off at the trail on a Monday afternoon 7 years earlier, posted on Instagram that she was thankful for all the love, support, and prayers. She said she would share her thoughts when the gag order was lifted. Mike Patty, Libby's grandfather, would later say at sentencing, "I want to send out my appreciation that justice has been serviced for the girls. I'll always be grateful." On December 20, 2024, Judge Francis Gull sentenced Richard Allen 65 years for the murder of Libby German, 65 years for the murder of Abigail Williams, to be served consecutively 130 years. Under Indiana law, a person convicted of more than one murder and sentenced to more than a life term is not eligible for parole. Richard Allen, 52 years old at sentencing, will die in prison. Sheriff Tony Liggett reflected on what the verdict meant. A form of justice was served. But it does not bring Abby or Libby back. They did not deserve this. Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter, the man who had stood at those press conferences year after year, who had once spoken directly to the killer, thanked the families and the community of Delphi. He said the verdict started a new chapter for the community. Allen was transferred first to Westville Correctional Facility, then to Pendleton Correctional Facility. On July 18, 2025, he was transferred out of Indiana entirely to the Lexington Assessment and Reception Center in Oklahoma. High-profile inmates are sometimes moved out of state for protection, for separation from the communities their crimes devastated. Richard Allen now serves his sentence in Oklahoma, far from Delphi, far from the CVS on Washington Street, far from the Monon High Bridge. His defense team filed an appeal in March 2025. They maintain his innocence. They argue the conditions of his pretrial confinement were unconstitutional. They argue the confessions are unreliable. The appeal process will move forward, as is every convicted person's legal right. I want to end with Libby German, because in a case that involved years of online obsession, missed tips, courtroom drama, a misfiled piece of paper, and 61 confessions, it is easy to lose sight of the person at the center of it. She was 14 years old. She was on a trail she had walked before, with her best friend, on a day off school, and when something went wrong, when a man appeared on a bridge and began walking toward her, she thought fast. She raised her phone. She hit record. That decision, made in seconds by a 14-year-old who was almost certainly terrified, is the reason this case was ever solved. Not the investigators, though they worked tirelessly. Not the true crime community, though they cared deeply. Not even the volunteer file clerk who found the misfiled tip, though she matters enormously. In the final accounting, it was Libby German who did what had to be done. She documented her own killer. She preserved his voice. She held the phone steady enough to capture his image, and then that phone stayed with her, was found with her, and carried the evidence out of the woods. The Monon High Bridge Trail is still there. People still walk it. Families still hike it. There are memorials along the path. Flowers, notes, photographs, small markers left by people who want Abby and Libby to be remembered. The town of Delphi, 3,000 people, a meat-packing plant, people who say hello with smiles, carries this now, as part of its identity, as part of its history, as the place where two girls went for a walk on a school holiday and did not come home. Richard Allen will die in a prison in Oklahoma. Abby Williams and Libby German are buried in Carroll County, Indiana. They were 13 and 14 years old. They deserved more years than they got. They deserved better than what happened on that bridge. And because one of them had the extraordinary presence of mind to hit record, they got at least this much. The truth was named. The man was found. The verdict was spoken. This has been Vault of Crimes. If Abby and Libby's story moved you, if you believe their names deserve to be remembered, share this video. It takes 5 seconds. Leave a comment. Tell me what part of this case stayed with you. New cases every week. Subscribe so you never miss one. I'll see you in the next one.